Through this first series, we've been kind of looking at, I've called it the DNA of discipleship, this question of who are we in God's sight? Who are we the way God sees us and the way that we're meant to be? Because so often we see ourselves as a reflection of whatever's right in front of us. You know, it's the old expression that if you think of yourself as a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you see yourself as facing a lot of big struggles, you see yourself as really small. But the reality of God's plan for discipleship, the reality of it has always been that the church is God's plan A and there is no plan B. You and I together in this place for this mission in this reason, we're God's plan. We're intentionally here. This is not a mistake. We are not figuring this out as we go. We are simply trusting and following in the footsteps of the Creator. And so as we walk through this, we're turning this morning to the Epistle of James. If you have a Bible with you, I'd invite you to open it to the second chapter. If you want to do what I'm doing, I'm reading off of the Bible app. It's a great tool for personal devotional and practice. Or you can simply follow along because the words are on the screen. The words are on the screen. Perfect. So we're starting at verse 14. This is James, the brother of Jesus, speaking. What good is it, brothers and sisters, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save them? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warm and be filled," without giving them the things they need for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one? You do well. Good for you. But even the demons believe that and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see, that faith was active along with those works, and faith was completed by those works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works, and not by faith alone. We'll stop reading there. But again, let's take a second and reflect. I've always been kind of cheap. Beth has been working a good work in my life by convincing me that I shouldn't buy my shoes at Shoe Warehouse every single time. That the Walmart is maybe not the best place to buy jeans because I get frustrated because I buy these cheap things and they constantly fall apart, and I'm constantly going back to the store and buying new shoes or buying new jeans. And a couple of years ago for my birthday, Beth bought me a really nice pair of designer jeans that have lasted years and years and years. And this is Beth's way of convincing me that, you know, I'm not going to argue you into doing the right thing, but I'm going to just do it for you. And you're going to see and experience that, hey, you know, maybe spend a little bit of money. Sometimes it's worth it. But I never seem to learn my lesson. So when I'm put in charge of something, I immediately will default to the cheapest, worst option 100 times out of 100. So the other day we needed a cabinet for the bathroom in our place. And so I went on Wayfair and I looked at all of the different options, and I found the cheapest one I could possibly find that fit the space. And it came and it arrived very quickly. I was very impressed with how quickly they got it to us. And I started to build it, and immediately I put the screw in and the wood shattered around it. And so Beth, to her credit, didn't say, "I told you so," but she gave me that look that says, "I told you so." And Wayfair had very good return policies, and it was fine. We ended up getting something that turns out when you spend a little bit more money on the thing, it stays together, and you can actually put things in it without it collapsing under the weight of a toothbrush. But worth is a funny thing to kind of measure, because most of the time we can say certain things are worth more than other things because there's more time and resources that go into them. Things that are better made are worth more than things that are cheaply made. That's kind of just an objective thing that I think most people can agree on. A Ferrari is better than a Toyota. I think that's just an objective statement of reality. It's a better precision engine. It might not be better at doing everything, but we say it's better, and so it costs. Anyway, but this summer I was having a conversation about how weird it is to think about worth in those kind of terms. My dad and I were talking about the fact that every kind of game has been branded except chess. Chess and checkers is this game that sort of defies branding. There's no chess company. Even chess.com is just a really simple logo. There's no brand associated with it. There's no worth in a game like chess, which is weird because it's the oldest game, one of the oldest games that we have. And this led my dad and I on this weird rabbit trail of conversations. And I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, there's a brand called Supreme, which, if you've never heard about it, is a streetwear brand who is famously good at marketing themselves. They'll sell a white T-shirt with just the red logo that says Supreme on it, and it'll sell out crazy fast. Their whole marketing strategy seems to be make sure that demand outstrips supply and then profit. But a couple of years ago, it reached a head when they released a limited run Supreme branded brick. For $30 American, you could order only online 4-inch by 6-inch red clay brick. And immediately they sold out worldwide. Every single brick that they had printed in this limited run sold out in an instant. And within an hour of being available on the Supreme website and immediately selling out, these bricks were going up for sale on eBay for thousands of dollars. For a red clay brick with SUPREME written on the front. Thousands of dollars. Worth is a weird thing to try to peg down. And that's part of how I feel about the Epistle of James. I mean, we almost lost the Epistle of James in the creation of the New Testament as the Reformation was getting underway, and Martin Luther, the German monk who sort of sparked this movement that became known as the Protestant Reformation, famously despised the letter of James, particularly because of the passage that we just read. He called it the Epistle of Straw. And he said it's worth only to be thrown into a fireplace to keep you warm. The reality of worth is that it's a tricky thing to measure by any kind of objective standard. But the reality of it is that we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for epistles like James. Because as much as we think about church as a place where we come together to gather and think about how are we going to make a difference in our community and in our neighborhood, you don't get there by most of the rest of the New Testament. I mean, think about the fact that the Apostle Paul uses the phrase one another 101 times in the other half of the New Testament that he writes. But he's almost entirely dedicated to focusing on particular pastoral issues. How you deal with coming to the Lord's table if one person is really hungry and one person's not. These are the kind of particular issues that he deals with. His letters are very pastoral, but they're very specific. James is instead writing to a group of Jewish Christians in what's called the diaspora, Jews who lived outside of Jerusalem. Because James came to occupy a unique place in the early church. where Paul was sort of the missionary who went out and traveled and became known as the apostle to the Gentiles, James, the brother of Jesus, stayed at home and ministered to the early Christian converts. And so these churches, as they were starting in Galatia and Thessalonica and Corinth and all these places that we read about in the New Testament, as they were just fledglings, James was pastoring the established church and writing a letter to Jewish Christians who were not sure how to deal with the Gentile stuff that was going on around them. These Jewish Christians were a lot like us in some ways. They were inheritors of a faith, but also responders to it. They saw themselves as a continuation of what Judaism had always been, a reforming and a revelatory process where God would come and do amazing work in the lives of the people, and it would be their responsibility to go and live that out. They saw themselves responding to God himself coming in and stepping into their midst, not as creating a whole new religion apart from Judaism, but as continuing what Judaism had always been about, God's great rescue plan for humanity. And so the Jewish people, Jewish Christians, occupied this weird thing because they were both the first generation to really have to wrestle with this question of how do we shape an identity as Jewish Christians, but also what do we do about continuing our legacy as Jewish Christians with our children, right? Like these were living and active questions for the Jewish Christians living outside of Jerusalem. They didn't have a temple and a community to fall back on. And so James writes to them with this unique perspective that says how you live and how you interact yourself and how you carry yourself forward is actually more important in a pagan society than you realize. And so we today in the church are actually inheritors of this kind of faith perspective. Like the reason that the baptismal font is at the front of our sanctuary every single week is a reminder that we are inheritors of this faith, but we are called to respond to it. That we came into this by an act of sheer grace. God's yes in our lives, God's yes to our soul, God's yes over every single part of us. And our response comes out of that. James writes to these Christians who are struggling with what it means to be faithful in a faithless generation. And so, in that sense, James is speaking to us. Through the centuries, James is speaking to us who are here today in new territory. And I know I've said this every single week that I've been up here, but this is new territory. When Lewis and Clark were sent out and commissioned by Thomas Jefferson to go and explore the Louisiana Purchase, they did what explorers had ahead of them had always done. They got their backpacks, they picked up their canoes, and they started to portage. And they got all the way up to what's today Colorado, and there was these funny things in the middle of their path called mountains. And I don't know if you know anything about mountains, but they're notoriously difficult to canoe. And so Lewis and Clark were faced with a choice. As we go forward to do what we're called to do, can we just do things the way that they've always been done before? And do we stop moving forward? Or do we put down our canoes and go with a spirit of adventure and go in a spirit of uncertainty and go with the sense of wonder and amazement at what God is going to do in our midst? James's response to both of the questions that the Jewish Christians were asking, to both of the questions of how do we bring more people into this experience of Jesus, and how do we shape our children so that they can respond to this question, James's response to both of these questions is the same. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. This is the part that the Apostle Paul had this is the part that Martin Luther had a big problem with. He hated that anything other than righteousness and faith in Jesus Christ as the risen and reigning Savior of the world and Lord of life could save us. And none of that is what James is particularly saying. We'll get into that in a second. But this passage is the reason is the reason that Martin Luther wanted to do away with the whole epistle. He saw this as so central to what James was talking about that he thought that the entire rest of this letter had no value for the Christian life. Fortunately, he decided not to make that a hill to die on, and we are blessed to still have this letter, this information. But James's approach is unique and I think helpful and instructive for us, because it tackles what are really the two main ways that we're told or that we tell ourselves we want to do evangelism. Because the reality is that we want to do evangelism. We say that every single time that we gather here at CPC. That we, like the friends in Mark chapter 2, want to bring people to lay them at the feet of Jesus. That's the story that we tell ourselves over and over and over again. We want to evangelize, and that's actually a normal human emotion. Humans we're okay with evangelism. It's proselytization that makes us a little edgy. But like, if you've seen a great movie, you've been to an amazing concert, or you've listened to a life-changing album, or you've read a good book, you tell people about it. We do that instinctively and naturally, and we do it all the time with a million different things, and we feel like this is this area of our life that we have to carve out when we've had amazing life-changing experiences in church. And so maybe the problem with evangelism in church is that we're not having great life-changing experiences here anymore. Maybe we need to look at what it takes to have a great life-changing experience in church, and then evangelism can come out of that. But the reality of James's story is that if we want to evangelize, the ways that we want to do it aren't going to work anymore if we're in this new territory. Because the first way is to simply have good intentions. And this is one of these things that Presbyterians we love this part. We love having good intentions. We're really good at having good intentions. We tell ourselves that we'll talk about things to the point of convincing ourselves that we've actually done something by talking about it. Like if you've ever spent any time in our decision-making process, you know how tedious it can be. Like the fact that, from the time that I met with the search team at our last meeting, to preaching for the call, to then having that call processed to the presbytery in Calgary, and then to the presbytery here, and then again to the presbytery in Calgary, and then into my hands, where I had 10 days to make a decision that I then had to return it to the presbytery of Calgary, who then had to return it to the presbytery of Niagara Falls, who then had to put it in front of you, and then we had to come to the induction, where there was other voting that happened ahead of the actual service, where then I stood up and made promises again in front of all of you and all of the presbytery, and then we get to this point. All of the steps, all of the discussion, all of the pieces that go into making anything happen in our denomination they're all there for a reason. I'm sure there's good and simple reasons for it, but all of it creates a culture where Presbyterians love to talk about things. We love to talk and reflect, and we do so much of it that we convince ourselves that we've actually accomplished something. When the reality of intentions is that so much of it simply becomes a missive thrown out into the air. Every time a tragedy happens, you see your Facebook or your Twitter feed fills up with #thoughts and prayers. People shouting into a void their good intentions that, boy, I really wish somebody would do something about this problem. Boy, I really wish systemic racism wasn't such a difficult thing to navigate. Oh, well, I need to go and figure out my lunch. Boy, I really wish that the challenges that we're facing today were something more than, pray for Haiti, pray for Afghanistan. We fill our lives and our social media feeds with good intentions, and we convince ourselves that that's enough. James envisions a conversation between two people, a blesser and a blessee, one who needs something, needs a home, needs warmth, needs food, needs clothing, needs their basic necessities of life filled, and one who simply says to them, be warm and be filled. Now, before we give this straw man not enough credit, there is an interaction that's happening here. It's not that there's no interaction. It's not that there's an indifference to these intentions, but the intentions cost this person nothing. There is no sacrifice involved in this person's thoughts and prayers. If it costs him nothing, her nothing, to offer good thoughts, good intentions, good deeds, can they really be called good? I mean, we live in this fabulously wealthy world. We are the wealthiest 1% of the wealthiest 1% of people who have ever lived. If you have a change drawer, you are in the top 1% of the top 1% of the top 1%. Congratulations. It costs us nothing to be kind. It costs us nothing to the point that we actually get charitable benefit on our taxes every year when we do good works for other people. There is no sacrifice involved in being charitable. There is no cost involved to us in doing good works, for the most part. The way we think about charity and sympathy and intentionality in the church today is safe, it is sterile, and it costs us nothing. If you want to know what is really important to someone once wrote that the only things you need to look at are how they spend their time and how they spend their money. Jesus said himself that where a person's treasure is, there his heart will be also. The things that cost us something, those are the things that actually matter to us. And James's question for us standing in this new place is, do your intentions actually lead you to sacrifice? Because if they don't, they're not costing you anything, and you're not really following in the footsteps of Jesus. Because Jesus stooped down and had great intentions to wash his disciples' feet, and he did it. And it really cost him nothing. It was a great object lesson. I mean, you can say the dignity is worth something of washing, smelly feet, and the status was a thing at the time, and those are important conversations. But the reality of Jesus washing his disciples' feet cost him nothing. But he did it as an object lesson because he wanted to remind them that what was going to happen the next day would cost him everything. Jesus was about to go through the worst hell that the world has ever experienced and the worst torture that humankind has ever created. Jesus was about to go to the cross where the word excruciating comes from. That was what he wanted his disciples to remember. That is what he wanted his disciples 2,000 years later to catch on to. That if our love costs us nothing, if our love takes no time away from what we love, takes no money away from what we love, we are just saying to that person, be warm and be filled. We are not really evangelizing. We are not really reaching out if all we do is offer our thoughts and prayers. The other side of the coin, though, is the one that churches today are maybe less familiar with, but the one that's for me personally a harder pill to swallow. I love arguing about theology. I almost always will find a chance. We had a great conversation with my brother-in-law arguing about the particular nuances of what Jesus meant when he talked about family in one point. I love debate. I love spirited conversations. These are parts of me that you may never want to get to know, and that's fine, well, and good, but I love good, fun argument for the sake of it. There's nothing that my friends and I love to do more than grab a beer and sit down and pick each other and push each other to think better. And I tell myself in my weaker moments that I want everyone to be like that. I probably don't want everyone to be like that because that would be really pedantic and really boring. But I want Jesus to give me a theological exam at the end of history. I want that to be the standard that I measure myself on because I find a sense of certainty in that. That if I know the right doctrine, that if I know the right answer to your questions, that if I can just spend more time studying and practicing and learning and growing and figure this out, then I can have all the other answers to all the other questions that I don't have the answers to. That when I struggle with uncertainty and fear, that I can just know my way out of those problems. I want to know my way out of my problems. But that hasn't worked out so well for me in the past. My problems continue to rise up no matter how much knowledge I gain about them. James reminds us that having a right belief system is fine for you, but has never been the goal. If Jesus had wanted us to be perfect theologians, I think he would have probably called Pharisees to be his disciples rather than fishermen. Right? Like, Jesus called everyday people who, by most standards, were illiterate, who couldn't write and really didn't do a great job of critical thinking, to take his message to the rest of the world. That tells me that Jesus wasn't particularly interested in our credentials. Jesus wasn't particularly interested in how smart we were, because it was never about convincing people. People are notoriously difficult to argue into or out of positions. In fact, one neurologist has found that when you tear down a system, no matter how rhetorically sound, no matter how logically connected your argument is, if that system is how the person sees themselves as part of a tribe or a community, immediate mental barriers go up. If me thinking my way out of Christianity is going to mean I'm thinking my way out of my community, my friends, my family, my faith place, then I'm not going to think myself out of Christianity. And I'm certainly not going to think myself into it either. Apologetics and arguing with people about faith and faith perspectives is kind of a moot point. It doesn't work. It doesn't do anything. It's a terrible evangelism tool. That's why James himself, I think he picks at a scab that the Apostle Paul leaves when he quotes the exact same passage that Paul quotes in Galatians chapter 3. He says, "Don't you know it was by works that Abraham was justified when he sacrificed his son Isaac?" Paul has 30 years ago, and at this point, used that exact story as an argument for justification by faith alone, apart from works. Paul and James, what they do is they actually reveal the weakness inherent in having a perfect theological position. Because if we sit down and we talk about it for long enough, eventually we're going to find some point where we disagree. Because our language, our experiences, our thoughts, our processes, our practices are always going to be conditioned and shaped by what's happened to us in the past, by our context. And so it's impossible to argue someone into a faith perspective because they're different from you. James's point is that if that's your goal, it's never going to reach the next generation. And so we need something else entirely. Intentions will not be enough, and right intentions won't be enough, and right beliefs won't cut it either. So what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? James says, "Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works." The reality of the world that we live in is that there is no one but you that is going to be able to announce the gospel to your neighbors, your coworkers, your friends, and your family. And so don't you think you owe it to them to make sure that the gospel that you share with them is actually good news. That's what the word gospel means. Good news. That it has an intention component to it. You have an obligation to your friends, to the people that you love, to be good to them, but to be good in a way that's cost you something. The gospel is not about making polite Canadians more polite. It's not about holding the door open for someone and being chivalrous and charitable and kind. Jesus did not die on the cross to make Canadians more polite. But if you interact with people in a costly way, if you find space to give your time and money away from things that you love towards things that you don't, toward things that other people love, wouldn't that be so much more than just thoughts and prayers? And could you imagine if it was actually news? If in this world of a million different ideas all competing for your time and attention, you lived and acted in such a way that you announced that the God who made everything has stepped into human history, that the single greatest defensible reality of Christian theology, the single greatest truth that we have is that there was a tomb at one point that was filled, and 3 days later that tomb was empty. We have historical evidence that the resurrection is the single greatest defining characteristic of Christianity. And so if we lived in a sense that we were going to try to announce that reality to the world, that resurrection can happen because resurrection has happened, that the worst thing is never going to be the last thing, that God is still doing something, that God is still moving stones, that God is still at work in our world. If we lived in a way that could trust in that to be news again, and at the same time let that news carry us forward with more than just our intentions. What a world we could make. Show me your faith apart from your actions, says James, and I will show you my faith by my actions. James carried this message out. He tried to live this to the point that his opponents got so tired of him ministering with grace to everyone in his community that they dragged him to the top of the Jewish temple and threw him from its pinnacle. James was martyred. James died living this out. Show me your faith apart from your actions, and I'll show you my faith by them. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.